Every day, people eat more than 5 million tons of cheese. It is in kitchens on opposite sides of the world. A shepherd in Greece eats it in the morning. A factory worker in Wisconsin unwraps it at lunch. A family in Tokyo melts it over dinner without thinking much about it. Few foods have traveled so far, lasted so long, or become such a normal part of daily life. And the first person who made it was not trying to invent anything new. That person was probably a merchant somewhere in the Middle East, thousands of years ago. He was carrying milk across the desert in a bag made from a sheep's stomach. When he stopped to drink, the milk was gone. In its place was something new, floating in a small amount of warm liquid. He ate it anyway. He did not eat it because he was curious. He ate it because he was hungry. And that accident, that moment when he had no other choice, became the beginning of one of the most important foods in human history. The merchant sits on the hot sand and looks into the open bag in his lap. He had expected milk, the thin, white liquid he had taken from his animals that morning. But inside the leather bag, the milk has changed into soft, white clumps. They float in a pool of thin, yellow-green liquid. At first, he is careful. In the desert heat, milk usually turns sour and bitter in just a few hours. But this is different. It smells fresh and strong, not spoiled. He does not know what is happening inside the bag, but something in it is still doing the same work it once did inside a living animal. The bag was made from the stomach of a young sheep. Even after the animal died, the stomach lining still held a natural substance called rennet. In nature, rennet helps a young animal digest its mother's milk by turning it into a more solid form. Inside the merchant's bag, it is still active. It pulls the milk proteins together. They gather into a soft white mass, while the thinner liquid stays below. As the merchant crossed the dunes, the bag kept moving from side to side. The milk inside was shaken again and again. The heat of the sun helped the change happen faster. By the time he stopped to rest, the milk no longer moved like a drink. The solid part held together, and the rest had separated below it. He reaches into the bag with his fingers and pulls out a piece of the solid curd. It feels rubbery and mild. When he tastes it, it is richer than he expected. Then he lifts the bag and drinks the remaining liquid. It eases his thirst, and the curds ease his hunger. More important than the taste is one simple fact. The milk has changed, but it has not gone bad. In the days that follow, he begins to test what happened. The same bag, the same heat, and once again, the milk changes. He learns to separate the solid part from the liquid on purpose. He squeezes the liquid out through a cloth and keeps the dense white part of the milk. He carries this knowledge home and tells his community what happened. Someone collects fresh animal stomachs and pours new milk inside. The bags sit in the sun for a full day. When they are opened, the same thing appears again. White curds above and clear liquid below. The milk thickens. The same white pieces appear. The same clear liquid settles at the bottom. It works. But an accident only matters if people find a reason to keep repeating it. And the world had a very good reason. The wind begins to change. In the high mountains of the ancient world, the green summer grass slowly turns brown and dry. A family stands outside their stone hut and watches the first gray clouds of autumn gather over the peaks. They look at their small herd of goats. For months, these animals have given them a steady supply of fresh, warm milk. But as the air grows colder, the family knows what is coming. Soon, there will be less milk. The animals will need their strength just to survive the winter. Fresh milk goes bad quickly. It is mostly water, with sugars and proteins that bacteria can use very fast. A bowl of milk left in the sun for half a day can turn sour and unsafe. For early humans, this was a constant problem. In the warm months, they often had more milk than they could drink. In the long winter months, they had none left. But inside the hut, something has changed. On a high wooden shelf, away from the damp air, sit several heavy, round wheels. They are hard to the touch and covered with a thick outer skin. They do not look like milk, and they do not smell like milk. By following what others had already learned, these people now know how to remove the water and keep what matters most. They have used salt and pressure to push the liquid out. leaving behind a dense food full of fat and protein. When the snow finally falls and blocks the door, the father reaches for the shelf. He takes down a wheel and cuts a thick slice. It is salty, rich, and full of calories. As the children eat, the food helps keep them warm through the freezing night. What the herd gave them in summer is still feeding them many months later. Scientists in Poland found clay pots from around 5,500 BC. These pots had small holes in them and were used to drain liquid away from curds. Thousands of miles away, the same food appeared in the tombs of Egyptian kings. Builders placed gold, grain, tools, and hard cheese beside the dead. In the dry air, those wheels stayed whole long after fresh food would have disappeared. A family could survive the winter that way. But once people learned that this food could last, travel, and still feed the body months later, it could do more than sit on a shelf in a mountain hut. Feeding a family through winter is one thing. Feeding an army across a continent is something else. The sound of 30,000 Roman sandals hitting the stone road makes a steady, heavy rhythm. A Roman legion is more than a group of soldiers. It is like a traveling city, and it must be fed every single day. As the sun beats down on the dusty roads of Gaul, each soldier carries a heavy pack. Inside that pack, between his tools and his blanket, sits a small, hard piece of salted cheese. It is dry, dense, and heavy for its size. For a man who must march 20 miles a day while wearing armor, that small piece matters. The leaders of Rome understood a simple truth. A hungry army cannot keep moving. They needed food that lasted longer than meat and caused less trouble than moving live animals. Fresh meat went bad in the afternoon heat. Driving cattle across long distances slowed the army and filled the road with noise. Cheese could last for months in a soldier's bag. It needed no cooking. It did not spoil quickly. A man could eat it while walking and keep going. The Romans took the old skill of cheese making and made it more organized. They wrote down methods for pressing curds. They recorded how much salt helped cheese last longer. They built dairies near military camps and towns, creating supply lines that reached from the hills of Italy to faraway places like Britain. In every new place they entered, they looked at local milk and saw its value. They taught local people methods that made cheese easier to store, carry, and move. As the legions moved, the knowledge moved with them. A soldier from Rome might find himself in a forest in Germany, eating cheese made from local milk, but shaped by methods learned far to the south. Roman roads carried more than troops and commands. They also carried habits, tools, and ways of preserving food across long distances. Over time, ideas about flavor, texture, and aging spread across the continent. In one province after another, local people changed those methods to fit their own caves, animals, weather, and grass. Long after the army had passed through, the practice remained. Cheese stayed behind in villages, storehouses, and cellars, even where Roman power itself did not last. The empire that spread those methods across Europe eventually fell apart. Roads broke, garrisons emptied, trade routes became less reliable. But the knowledge did not disappear with the legions. After Rome was gone, cheesemaking survived in places built for patience, not war. Outside the monastery walls, the world is full of disorder. Empires have fallen. The great Roman roads are slowly breaking apart with time and neglect. But inside the thick stone walls of a remote abbey, the air is still. The only sound is the slow drip of water onto the damp floor of a cellar cut into limestone. A monk in a rough brown robe moves between long wooden shelves. In one hand, he carries a small brush. In the other, a bowl of salt water. This is his work, and he returns to it day after day. During the Middle Ages, monasteries were some of the few places in Europe where order remained and records were kept. While much of the continent struggled with war, hunger, and weak trade, the monks lived by a strict schedule. They had time. They had discipline. They also had cellars that stayed cold and damp. Because they could read and write, they began to keep careful notes about what happened in those rooms. They wrote down the temperature of the caves, the condition of the grass, the season of the milk, and the number of days a wheel sat in darkness before it changed. The monk stops in front of a heavy wheel marked with blue lines. In that corner of the cellar, the air is wetter than in the rest of the room. Over time, the monks learned that this damp air helped mold grow through the cheese. The wheel changed slowly. Its smell became stronger, and its taste became deeper. In other monasteries, the work was different. Some monks washed the outside of the cheese with beer or wine. The outer layer changed first, and then the inside changed too. None of this happened quickly. These were slow discoveries, made by people who repeated the same work again and again for years. In those cellars, cheese became more than stored food. It became something people could shape through patience. The monks learned that pressing a wheel harder changed how long it would last. They learned that caring for the surface changed the smell, the outer layer, and the texture inside. They learned that air, stone, moisture, and time all left their mark on the final wheel. Cheese responded to the room around it, and to the hands that kept tending it. What had once been a way to save milk for later was now beginning to carry the character of a place. One valley did not produce the same wheel as the next. One cellar did not age it in the same way as another. By the time these practices had passed through generations of monasteries, some cheeses were already tied to specific caves, specific regions, and specific expectations. Once people began to recognize one place by the taste of its cheese, the question changed. It was no longer only how to make a wheel last. It became how to stop someone else from using the same name. A man in a dark suit walks through a quiet warehouse in northern Italy. Around him, thousands of golden wheels of cheese sit on tall wooden racks. He does not look like a chef. He looks like an inspector. In his hand, he carries a small silver hammer. He stops in front of a wheel that has been aging for 2 years. He taps the rind and listens to the sound. If the inside has a crack, the wheel does not pass. With a sharp metal tool, he scrapes the name from the surface. Without that mark, the wheel loses much of its value. In the markets of the 17th century, a merchant no longer stood before a crowd and shouted only, "Hard cheese." He said, "Roquefort." He pointed to a particular valley. He spoke about limestone caves, mountain air, and the blue veins that formed in that darkness. The name carried the place with it. When buyers heard the word, they expected something more specific than food. They expected a wheel tied to land, method, and reputation. The people of those regions understood what that meant. If a farmer far away could copy the work and use the same name, the value built over generations could slowly slip out of their hands. So the law moved closer to the cellar. New rules said that some cheeses belonged to the places they came from. Before a wheel left the village, it could be stamped or marked. The sign on the rind told buyers where it came from and what standards stood behind it. That system lasted for a long time. Then, migration carried old recipes across the Atlantic. Italian families made cheese in Wisconsin, New York, and California. They used familiar methods. They used familiar names. Back in Parma, producers watched those names appear on labels far away from the region that had made them famous. The argument that followed moved from farms and markets into courtrooms, trade offices, and international negotiations. These arguments were never only about taste. They were about who had the right to claim a tradition and what exactly a name was protecting. Was it a recipe? Was it a method? Was it a region? Was it all of them at once? By that point, cheese had become something people inspected, certified, defended, and challenged long after the wheel itself left the cellar. A name on a rind could now carry money, memory, and territory with it. A man in Chicago sits in a quiet laboratory in 1916. His name is James L. Kraft. He is staring at a bowl of cheddar and watching the edges grow dark as the air slowly changes the milk. On the table, he tests a new process. He adds a mixture of sodium salts to a large container of melting cheese. As he stirs, the oil and water stop separating. The liquid becomes smooth and even. When it cools, it does not become a living wheel that needs careful aging. It becomes a stable block that can sit behind glass for months without changing very much. Before the First World War ended, the American military placed a large order. They needed food that could survive damp trenches, long transport, and poor storage without going bad. For soldiers, consistency mattered more than origin. Whether the tins crossed the Atlantic or sat in mud near the front, the contents were expected to stay the same. Millions of pounds were shipped overseas. That logic did not end with the war. It fit the modern supermarket just as well. Industrial food needed long shelf life, standard texture, clean packaging, and easy transport. Processed cheese answered those needs. It could be made in huge amounts, moved across long distances, and sold to shoppers who cared less about caves and aging rooms than about price, convenience, and predictability. Today, both versions sit under the same roof. In one aisle, a customer reaches for a wedge aged in a French cave for 6 months. In the next aisle, another customer picks up a pressurized can of yellow foam. The label tells part of the story. The FDA does not allow Kraft's invention to be called simply cheese. The official term is processed cheese product. But the difference between those two foods is not only legal, it is historical. One comes from cellars, regions, and slow change. The other comes from factories built to make every block the same. Americans buy the processed version in enormous amounts. The older forms remain too, still tied to place, aging, and craft. Neither one removed the other from the shelf. Instead, they settled into the same modern life, serving different habits, different budgets, and different ideas of what cheese should be. The merchant in the desert had no choice. He ate what he found because there was nothing else. 10,000 years later, the old wheel and the processed block both travel home from the store, and that long journey, from accident to industry, is the history of cheese. In the modern world, the next change would not come from the cave or the village. It would come from the factory.